So selective mutism, a lot of people don't understand what selective mutism means. They think that it means that the person is selecting to be mute. But what it means is mutism that happens in select circumstances. So in certain situations, in certain circumstances, like for instance, somebody picking up the phone, the person will become mute or will be unable to verbalize. Now, what some people are able to do to an extent is like they'll be in a state where they, by all rights, like should be selectively mute, like they are becoming selectively mute, and they'll try to push through it so hard that they can force out some sounds, maybe. They can force out some amount of language, but it will come at a significant cost, usually a lot of dysregulation. So, we know that at the very least, he has definitively, factually, in the past had selective mutism around being on the phone. And if what he's talking about here is in fact, going completely mute or like only barely able to get out, like force out some sounds. Sometimes we also know that he, was experiencing selective mutism in that situation. For what reason? We don't necessarily know. Selective mutism can happen for a variety of reasons. This is going to be a long tangent, very possibly. And I'm going to hope that you trust me enough to stick with me on it, because I think that for the people who find value in this but don't know much about it, you're going to find a lot of value in it if you stick with me. And if you have friends who have any sort of selective mutism, this will be really valuable. There are a few questions. So selective mutism is also what I got some questions online about. So we'll go through a lot of things about this. There are a number of reasons that selective mutism can happen. I'm going to throw out some. Let's see. I wrote down at one point. We've got apraxia of speech, which is also referred to as verbal dyspraxia. I've talked about dyspraxia a little bit before, but so apraxia of speech, verbal dyspraxia. We've got developmental language disorder. We've got language impairment with or without autism. We've got phonological disorders. We've got vocal dysphoria. Somebody in chat says spasmodic dysphonia. So there's like a few different things, some of which are more medically oriented, like some of which are more physically based. So spasmic dysphonia is based on like vocal cords. It's a like very physical thing. Some of these other ones are developmental, so apraxia of speech, verbal dyspraxia, or developmental language disorder. Those are very developmental. Vocal dysphoria is much more emotional. Those are some of our like developmentally oriented reasons. We've also got anxiety disorders. Although I would say that if an anxiety disorder is so significant that it is causing selective mutism, and like that's the cause, right? So like all there is at play is anxiety, and anxiety is not a secondary symptom itself. if what's at play is anxiety, and the anxiety itself is so severe that it's causing selective mutism, I would probably put down a phobia at that point. Like, we're probably at phobic levels if that's the level of anxiety that somebody is experiencing. I would be really surprised to see that level of anxiety that's just due to anxiety, again, when the anxiety is not a secondary symptom, without any type of panic. I'm not saying that's impossible. I'd just be really surprised to see it. So obviously what people are wondering, if you've watched any of my content, is how autism might play into this. So selective mutism is really, 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 really common with autism. So obviously we have people who are non-speaking and non-verbal autistics. These are two different things. Non-verbal autistic does not use language at all. Use word-based language at all. They use other forms of language, but they don't use word-oriented language. Non-speaking autistics, which is more common as people get older. Nonverbal is a little bit more common. Like, it happens more frequently in people who are quite young. But it certainly exists in older folks. Non-speaking is when people are unable to speak, but they can utilize language in other ways. You'll hear a lot of people say that they become non-speaking or they become nonverbal. This is something that non-speaking, autistics have really, really asked that we don't do, because it's such an identity-oriented thing. And it is more accurate to say that autistic folks become selectively mute. So I have selective mutism with a speech impediment. You will note that you do not often hear me say, the word girl, or the word even really, really is difficult for me. R's are really, really hard for me. You'll note that I just often skip an R in a word. I also have a history of stutters, right? So selective mutism is really common in autistic folks, especially during shutdowns and meltdowns. What can happen? So Hyunjin has some amount of selective mutism sometimes. It seems, based on what he's said, that selective mutism is related to some type of either anxiety or overwhelm or both. It's really more a matter of where that anxiety or overwhelm comes from. That's all of these things combined. But it could also, again, be something like dyspraxia of speech, which is not super uncommon, especially in, neurodevelopmentally disabled folks. What can happen is that if you become selectively mute, if you're somebody who has selective mutism and you don't understand that, it's super stressful and it can double down on itself. Or let's say you have some type of speech impediment or some type of... Bro, why didn't my light turn out? I even charged it before this. Whatever. I'll survive, I suppose. Let's say that, that distracted me so much. You have some type of... any type of these things. What can happen is, because speech is so important to us, we get very stressed out when we can't think of words to say. And it's very overwhelming. And what can also happen is that people, humans, expect you to respond to them quickly. and in some type of manner. And if you have issues processing language, or if you have issues responding with language, that becomes a very stressful thing, but it's a very common human interaction. Now, this can really double down with people who also potentially have issues with keeping track of conversational change. So, I have a number of clients who take a really long time to respond to things in general. I think all of these clients have been ADHD, both ADHD and autistic, or had dissociative disorders and autism, one or the other. I have clients, and when I say a long time to respond to things, I am a very patient therapist. I have to be, right? This is my client, my main client population. As much as I yap on and on and on, I'm very aware of when we need to hold silence. I usually will wait between 60 and 120 seconds before checking in if one of my clients who take longer to respond has dissociated. I have waited up to 4 minutes for a client to respond to a question. Now, for reference, I am going to pause speaking for 15 seconds, and you'll see how long that feels. So that was about 15 seconds. And that would be a very, very quick response for some of my clients. It's pretty complicated to explain what is often happening. But what usually is going on is people getting very, very lost in their heads about conversational paths and how to modularize the language they know to be able to fit to describe their experiences. And those are sort of two different things. I also have a lot of clients who I fully will sit there in session and have them make a phone call. Phone calls are very, very, very difficult for a lot of my clients because they don't really know how phone calls are going to go. You can script as much as you like, but things can really veer off of, you really don't know, especially if you're making a phone call to ask for information. And people will get really, really, really stressed about how to respond because it takes them time to figure out how to put their language together. And it's time that they don't know how to ask for, right? They have not practiced saying, by the way, it takes me a little bit of time to respond to things. You may have to be patient on the phone with me. Or doing that in an interview. Or doing that when they go to a party. Or doing that ever. People don't know how to do that. People really, that's a very difficult request for people to make. Now, this is the sort of uncertainty about change and expectation and rules is, common for anybody, both with rigidity of thinking, right? So anything that has strong rigidity of thinking, and difficulty adapting to change, conversations can be really hard and can result in, if not selective mutism, really strong difficulty piecing together, that language quality. This is even harder with like memory issues, especially with working memory issues, because you're trying to remember the context of the conversation. So for me, in my mind, I'm very good at improv for a variety of reasons. I'm good at improv because I've practiced it, like formally. I'm good at improv because I'm a dungeon master. I'm good at improv because I'm very terrified of having conversations with other people. I'm a deeply socially anxious creature. I worked really, really hard as I was growing up to figure out how to quickly be able to respond to people. And the way I do that involves a lot of like basically caching former conversations and different pieces of context, right? Like I have files and files and files of reference material in my head. I throw out half of that reference material for any one thing I'm doing. I put some of it in like background processing. I'm constantly like putting things into the cache of the conversation. And then recalling that cache, like I'm constantly asterisking parts of my conversation. In order to do this, like right now, I have several things in the cache of where I'm going with this. Even with this metaphor, I have several things in the cache, and at some point, I'll pull that back up. I also have several things running as just like archived reference data, but I've also thrown out most of my life of context reference data in order to have this conversation. I don't need to parse all that shit for this. It's irrelevant to this. And then I have like some background processes that just always run no matter what context I'm in. If somebody has issues with working functional memory, they can't do that shit, right? Like that's a very complex thing. As far as managing context in your brain. And a lot of ADHD folks, like some of the disability is kind of an inability to hold on to those strands as the conversation goes. So we're increasing our level of stress, of confusion, of uncertainty. We don't know how a conversation is going to go. And then we don't trust ourselves to remember all of the relevant context to make sure that conversation goes well. We don't trust ourselves, like there's a lack of trust of, am I going to like be able to contemplate, am I going to be able to pull things from my life? Am I going to be able to modularize my language? Am I going to be able to remember all of my language, to be able to find the right words to put this together? How am I supposed to sort through all of that? Right? So that can be a very, very, very overwhelming question that can lead to a lot of anxiety. And then that anxiety just continues to double down on itself as this problem is not addressed, right? As people aren't building appropriate coping skills, they're just like sort of forcing themselves through it. They're just, practicing saying, hello, my name is Hyunjin, to be able to get on the phone, instead of like really being able to identify like, okay, what is happening that's making it so difficult for me to manage a phone call. And so I'm not surprised that eventually that had to reach a head. That had to reach like this point of contention of that building to be so anxiety inducing that he would start to experience selective mutism in new situations, especially situations that really hit his core values, that really hit what's important to him, that like is at like he feels is at risk. There comes a point where like clearly he was just so distrustful of his voice, of his ability to, be able to communicate, that it started feeling like it was crashing around him, even with a vocal coach. Because that can also be really, really disheartening. Let's say you're working with a vocal coach, you're working with people, you're trying to get professional help, and you're still struggling with like this problem of like sometimes you can't speak and you don't necessarily fully understand why. Yeah, of course that would be so incredibly disheartening and would feel really, really hopeless. Like, what? How do I do this? How do I manage that? What do I do about this? So that was a lot of a tangent on selective mutism. There was a question in chat that I don't think I know the answer to. Does selective mutism account for the change in the sound of his voice over time? I think that would depend. I am not an SLP. I am not an SLP. I'm not a speech and language pathologist. That would probably depend on what the selective mutism is related to. So what's our core issue? Certainly, vocal dysphoria. Yeah, absolutely. um, uh, Speech apraxia, I'd have to do a little bit more research on common experiences. Unfortunately, most of the information on most of the underlying causes I brought up, most of the information is about children. It's about like very young people. So developmental language disorder, speech dyspraxia, pretty much everything on those things. The research is around kids, or the information you get is around kids. So I did a little bit of research on this when the Encore first dropped, and yeah, and unfortunately, I was not able to find a ton more than what I already knew, because so much of the info is on kids, is around like children's experiences, and thus we can't really qualify like how commonly vocal tone and vocality changes in people with these various things that can result in selective mutism. You're about to get an ad break in 5 seconds, so I'm gonna shut the fuck up.